Professor Stent, members of the Council, guests and friends, on behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening. It never gets exciting enough when we're talking about Russian affairs, and today is no exception. It's a wonderful topic. You all know what it is. It's Putin's world. Russia against the West and with the rest. And Professor Stent has published a book recently by that title. It's available, by the way, in Barnes & Noble's bookstores, all their stores within 25 miles. We unfortunately don't have copies tonight, but it is available. It's a wonderful book. And those who are most serious, who I know about Russian affairs, think very, very highly of it. Indeed. Professor Stent has her master's degree, her bachelor's degree from Cambridge in economics and modern history. Her MA degree in international relations from the London School, and her study at Harvard resulted in an MA in Russian studies and a PhD from the Department of Government at Harvard. She presently is at Georgetown, as all of you know. She's a professor of foreign service and government there. She also is the director of the Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies program at Georgetown. And there are a couple of students here who are going to be joining you there in the relatively near future. I'm struck by the careful and way in which she has covered the last decades of Russian affairs. Her first book, interestingly, was on the political economy between West Germany and the Soviet Union, covering 25 years up until 1980, and culminating in Ostpolitik, of course. She also has written on the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the fall of the Soviet Union, the unification of the two Germanys, and the Europe which follows all of that. And then, as many, she pondered about the possibilities of the United States and Russian relations into the future, a topic of one of her books. And as I said, the topic of this evening's lecture is the same title as her current book. As you would expect, she has, of course, written numerous articles. Her essays have appeared in the outstanding journals of the country and in Germany as well. I was struck, I happened by accident to hear one of her interviews on C-SPAN, and I was so impressed by her command of the subject matter, which of course is the product of years at Georgetown, and in the classroom and in serious observation and in writing. The topic tonight is of first-rate interest to us. All of us are concerned not only with the crises of the moment, but the long-term relations with Russia as well, because the United States and Russia, of course, at some point have to be on the same page, at least, when occasionally our interests do overlap. It's a wonderful opportunity for all of us, and my great pleasure to present Professor Stent.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bird. Good evening, everybody. Little did I know when we first arranged this date that this would be the day in which Secretary Pompeo met with both Foreign Minister Lavrov and President Putin. And I happened to just, before I came in here, look at my iPhone and see that at the conclusion of, I think, nearly 2 hours with President Putin, Secretary Pompeo said that they'd had very good discussions, that they had talked about Syria. He also had with him our special representative for Syria, Ambassador Jim Jeffries, that they talked about Afghanistan. When asked about the interference in the elections, Secretary Pompeo said, yes, it happened. Earlier on that day, Foreign Minister Lavrov had said, no, it didn't happen. And President Putin had said the Mueller report was exotic, but at least it showed that there was no collusion. And so it looks, I haven't watched it, and I'm sure we can all watch it on television later. I haven't seen it, but it looks as if they did get somewhere, that they were trying to, I think, normalize relations, establish strategic stability talks, which is something that the Trump administration has been trying to do for some time. And when asked about whether President Trump would meet with President Putin on the margins of the G8 summit in Osaka in a few weeks, Secretary Pompeo said that he thought he would. And then when one of the journalists asked them, yes, but last time there was a G20, they did not meet because one of the conditions was for the Russians to release the Ukrainian sailors they had just captured. This was last December. What about that? And so Secretary Pompeo, of course, very diplomatically said that's for the White House to decide. So I think we can see, I think there probably will be a meeting, and I think that that's a good thing, and we'll certainly come back to that. But as I say, I think we very judiciously chose this day for me to speak here. So I am going to talk about my book. I will be circling back to US-Russian relations, but really the point of the book is also to put this in a much more global context, to see that the United States is now dealing with a Russia that has reasserted itself on the world stage, is acting like a great power again, and therefore we have to understand the other parts of the world where it's involved. I will just show you the book. This is the cover with Mr. Putin on many television screens, as I say, it deals with Russia's really rise as a global power. So in the book, I asked 3 questions, and again, I think they're all very important for the US as it goes forward in dealing with Russia. And the first one is, why was the West so wrong in the 1990s in assuming that a post-communist Russia would want to become like the West, that it would want to adopt Western institutions, that it would become like a Western democracy, and that it wanted to become more integrated into global affairs? And why were we also wrong in assuming, which was an assumption, that if you had closer economic ties, closer trade ties, that somehow that would have a beneficial political effect that would help promote better political relations? The second set of questions I ask in this book is, how was Putin's Russia, with a per capita GDP less than that of Italy, a declining population, a crumbling infrastructure, how was it able to reassert itself so effectively on the global stage, returning to areas like the Middle East from which it had withdrawn after the Soviet collapse? And how did we get to a situation where, although Russia's relations with the West have really deteriorated seriously, most of the rest of the world regards Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business and whose interests are legitimate in a way that we in the West, I think, haven't been willing to accept. And then the third question, which is, of course, the hardest, is what should we do about this? How can we improve this? And I will come back to that at the end. So let me get to the first question. Why were we wrong about what we assumed in the 1990s? And I think one of the things we assumed when the Soviet Union collapsed is that the difficulty of dealing with the Soviet Union had largely been because they were communists, or they at least officially subscribed to Marxist-Leninist ideology, to a kind of dialectical view of the world where we were opposed to each other. Well, it turned out that the communist part of it was a sort of veneer superimposed on centuries of Russian traditions. So I don't want to say we were wrong because we forgot that they were Russians, but the fact that they were Russians was probably more important than the fact that they had at least officially subscribed to communist ideology. And what do I mean by this? I mean that there are centuries, really a millennium, of Russian culture and traditions and a way of Russia, of informing Russia's view of its place in the world that have made it much more difficult for us to achieve a more productive relationship with Russia. In the book, I quote the 19th century Slavophile poet Fyodor Turchev, who wrote, "There can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles." So no alliance between Russia and the West. And then he recommended that the solution for Russia was to promote Western disunity and division. Does that sound familiar? Putin, on numerous occasions, has accused the West of seeking to break up Russia. I think by now he genuinely does believe that the West is against Russia, that it would like to weaken Russia, that it would like to execute regime change there. And so Putin now portrays Russia and himself as a leader, really, of the conservative international, of traditional values against the satanic West. And he stresses that Russia has a unique civilization, which it does, and that civilization is different from and really incompatible with that of the West. These are things that he and the people around him stress very much. And so today, under Putin, Russia is determined to restore what it believes is its rightful place in the world, one that was snatched away from it when the Soviet Union collapsed. I have a former student of mine who now writes for The New Yorker. I have a number of former students who've gone on to do very well, I'm glad to say. And he's just finishing an interesting book about how young Russians view the collapse of the Soviet Union, and older ones. And what's very interesting is the majority of Russians today don't believe that the Soviet collapse was inevitable. They don't believe that it collapsed because of its own weakness, because the system wasn't sustainable. They believe that in the 1980s, Gorbachev was there, he was a weak leader, oil prices were very low. In other words, it was a conjunction of circumstances that led to something that didn't need to happen. And therefore, from their point of view, Russia should rightfully be restored to what it was before and not accept that the system itself was rotten. And if those are the beliefs of a majority of people, then obviously that affects the way they understand their dealings with the West. Now, there's a second, I think, very important historical influence on the way Russia views its place in the world, and that really is its historical sense of its place on the Eurasian continent and its history, right? Russia has no natural borders. The only natural border it has is to the north, and there's no precedent in Russian history for Russia accepting the loss of territories. If you look at the history, Russia has lost territory, then it's regained it. It's lost it, and it's regained it. Catherine the Great, the Prussian princess who became the Empress of Russia, said of Russia's fluid borders, that which stops growing begins to rot. And then she said, I have to expand my borders in order to keep my population secure. So this idea of defensive expansionism is very much still there. If you try and understand the way that Russia looks at Ukraine particularly, but at a number of its neighbors, that they are essential to its own security. And I would say today, the Russians define their security perimeter not as the borders of Russia, but as the borders of the former Soviet space. Because the perception in Russia, at least, is it's always been vulnerable to invasion, and it needs buffer states, lands, to buffer it against both in the west and the east and the south. Of course, that's not the perception of Russia's neighbors. If you talk to the Poles, they have a very different view of this, but that is still very much ingrained in the way that Russians study their own history. Now, second question, how was Russia able to play a weak hand so well? And the first answer to this is that Putin really did have a plan when he entered the Kremlin in 2020. I like to remind people that for Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not only, as he says, a great geopolitical catastrophe, but it was a personal catastrophe. He was there in East Germany as a 35-year-old mid-level KGB case officer doing rather well. He thought this was the beginning of a great rise to a great career, right? And then in 1989, the wall came down, and the population in Dresden tried to storm the building in which the Soviet KGB and the East German Stasi, the secret police, were co-located, to get their files. They wanted the documents. And so Putin recounts in a the year 2000 biography of him, or biographical interviews that were published when he first became president. He recalls staying all night in that building and burning files with his colleagues, and the furnace then exploded. And then he had to leave Dresden to drive back to Leningrad, as it then was, and he recounts how he and his wife put a washing machine on their car that they drove back to the Soviet Union, because they didn't have a washing machine like that in the Soviet Union, and then he was out of a job. I mean, of course, we can say he did pretty well after that. But at the time, right, this was a personal trauma for him, and I think you have to remember that too. So he had a plan when he came into office. He was going to restore a strong Russian state, because in the 90s, under Yeltsin, the state was was weak and it was chaotic and there'd been a major financial crisis, and he was going to restore Russia as a great power. In 2000, he said, Russia was and will remain a great power. This is preconditioned by the inseparable characteristics of its geopolitical, economic, and cultural existence. And there's a second reason why Russia was able to restore itself. So Putin had a plan. I would argue the United States and its allies in the post-war era didn't have a plan like that. And that's one of the reasons. But the second reason is that he was very good, and he's been very good at taking advantage of opportunities presented to Russia by the West's division, by the United States not really knowing what it wanted, having red lines, not having red lines, depending on the issue. In my book, I have a number of photos, and one of them is of an article from the evening paper in Leningrad from 1976 about the young judo champion, Vladimir Putin. He was 24 years old, and he just won the judo championship. Most people think of Russians, they think of chess. Well, judo is his sport. And this article said, you know, watch out for this young man, he's going places. So in judo, obviously, a weaker opponent can prevail. A weaker opponent, you can prevail over a stronger opponent if you're weaker than them, if you sense their own distraction, their own weakness. And Putin, I think, has been very good at taking advantage of these opportunities, of sensing sort of the weakness in the West's position, of manipulating people. Probably the training as a KGB case officer has helped with that too. And also, he's been in power now 19 years, so he's seen a lot of Western leaders, and not only Western leaders, come and go. And he's used that to his advantage. So by way of circling back to the United States, I'm not quite there yet. In my book, I describe two of what I think are the major successes of Putin's foreign policy, and we can obviously discuss those more in the question and answer period. And the first one is the rapprochement with China. So 50 years ago today, Soviet and Chinese soldiers were shooting each other across the border on the Amur River, and the famous American journalist Harrison Salisbury wrote a book called War Between Russia and China, published in 1969 without a question mark. Today, the Russian and Chinese leaders describe each other as their closest friends, their best partners. Their relationship is better than it's ever been, and that's certainly true if you look back at what was happening before. In the book, I have a picture of them making blini, Russian pancakes, together. President Putin is teaching President Xi Jinping how to make pancakes. And this is just around the same time that, for the first time, Chinese troops took part in Russian military maneuvers in the Russian Far East. The Chinese-Russian relationship used to be called an axis of convenience, where people said both countries are very wary of each other and they're just kind of using each other for their own purposes. There's still a debate about that, certainly in this country and also in Russia and in China, but I think today it looks much more like a real partnership that's becoming stronger. It's not an alliance, and neither of those two countries want allies, because they both believe that allies can restrain what you can do. But they both share a number of views. One of them is that the current global order is unfair. It has neglected their interests. It was imposed by the United States without their agency. And they're both determined to create a post-West order, whatever that is, and I think they define that differently, but one in which the United States doesn't have such a defining role, either politically or economically, certainly, in the Chinese case. They both obviously run authoritarian states, and neither of them would ever criticize the other for what they do domestically, unlike the United States and its allies that tend to criticize both countries for what's happening inside their countries. And they believe that it is time, really, for the West to recognize that they need, if you like, a better deal. China has enabled Russia to avoid the isolation that the West tried to impose on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine in 2014. We said we're going to isolate Russia. Well, China came along. It signed a major natural gas deal with the Russians at that time when we were imposing sanctions. The Chinese got very good terms then, because the Russians were in no bargaining position to extract better terms from them, but they got the deal. And China has really backed Russia up since then in all of its foreign policy initiatives, even though the Chinese will privately be quite critical of what Russia did in Crimea, because obviously the Chinese themselves have issues with some irredentist claims, but they have backed them up. But this is an increasingly asymmetrical partnership. China's a rising power. Russia is not a rising power. Russia is really the junior partner in this relationship. But my Russian colleagues say, yeah, but we're prepared to do that, to be that, because it's preferable, to being the junior partner of the United States. So we'll see how long that lasts. I would just say, when you look to the future, China, as you know, has this very ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. They just had another summit in Beijing about it, which will involve railroads and pipelines and huge infrastructure projects in Russia and China's common neighborhood, Central Asia, where they now have, I would say, a coexistence which works quite well. Russia does security. China is the major economic provider in Central Asia. I don't know how long that will last, and I'm not sure that the Belt and Road Initiative will really be that advantageous for the Russians. A couple of years ago, I attended a Chinese-Russian conference in Moscow, and the Chinese had very nice PowerPoint presentation on the Belt and Road, and they said this is a win-win situation for Russia and China. And when my Russian colleagues afterwards said to me, when they say win-win, they mean we win twice. So, the other, I would say, major success of Putin's foreign policy has been Russia's return to the Middle East as a major player, returning to areas where it hadn't been for a couple of decades. I see Professor Robert Friedman here, who's the great expert on Russia and the Middle East, and in my book I certainly cite his works, but it's quite remarkable how Russia has come back there. And in my book, I quote a senior Israeli official who said to me that Russia's policies and actions in the Middle East are aggressive, flexible, but cognizant of their limits. And unlike the United States, which has chosen sides in the Middle East, and we read just today that we're apparently going to deploy troops to possibly be used in this escalating conflict with Iran, Russia hasn't chosen sides. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union only wanted to deal mainly with countries that said they were socialist or they were going on their way to socialism. Now Russia talks to all of the different protagonists and antagonists in every conflict in the Middle East. So it has obviously a pretty close relationship with Iran, not untroubled, but at least pretty close with Iran, and with different Shia groups. It talks to all of the major Sunni states, and of course it has a burgeoning relationship with Israel. It also talks to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Kurds, so every group. And in fact, two of its, I would say, newer partners are both close allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia and Israel. They both share, obviously, a great concern about Iran, and they both hope that Russia can intervene or intercede with Iran to temper its ambitions in the region. I'm not sure that Russia actually has that amount of clout, but that's what they hope. From the Saudi perspective, the relationship with Russia is very much about keeping the price of oil up and production down. So Russia now has an agreement with the OPEC countries that they will restrict their output. We'll see how long that lasts, but it's lasted so far for a few years. And with Israel, it's obviously about the war in Syria, but it's also about the fact that 1.3 million Israelis come from the former Soviet Union, and there are all kinds of ties there. So Russia is very well positioned at the moment to be an arbiter in a way that the Soviet Union really never was. And when the Syrian civil war is over, I think Russia will hope to continue to play a predominant role there. Maybe that's something we can get back to in the question and answer period. So now let me turn to the West. I will say a few words about Europe and then turn to the United States. As Mr. Bird said, I've written a couple of books on Russian-German relations, so I do have a chapter here about the relationship between Russia and Germany. And two pictures, I think, illustrate some of the changes. The first one is one of the first times that Chancellor Merkel visited Mr. Putin in Sochi, just like Mr. Pompeo did today. She, of course, grew up in East Germany. She speaks fluent Russian. In fact, she won a prize for the best Russian speaker when she was in high school. So she she understands him and speaks his language. He speaks German, right? He spent these 5 years in the GDR, so they can talk without interpreters. So at this particular meeting, she was waiting for him to come in, and like a good former KGB agent, he clearly read her dossier, and he found out that she was afraid of dogs because she had been bitten by a dog as a child. So she's sitting there, and Putin had, I think she's probably no longer alive, a large black Labrador called Connie. And so Connie bounds into the room, and Chancellor Merkel obviously is a very experienced woman, and her face is very tight, but she doesn't show too much emotion, and Putin is kind of sitting there smirking at her. But the other picture I have is from last year, and this was just after the NATO meeting, where President Trump was highly critical of Chancellor Merkel, as he has been for a long time, and accused Germany of not paying enough, of being too dependent on Russian gas. Anyway, and shortly thereafter, she met President Putin, and he's standing there with a big bunch of red roses, and she's smiling. So that doesn't mean that the relationship is that good, but Germany is in an interesting position now because, for a long time for the Germans, Russia is a partner, however difficult it is. It's their neighbors with a few countries between them. They have a very long and difficult history, and it was important to continue to engage Russia. Then with the annexation of Crimea, which really shattered the kind of post-Cold War international and European order that Merkel had worked so hard to create, it became very difficult to deal with Russia. And in fact, she was reported to have told President Obama, after talking to President Putin after all these Ukrainian events, that he, quote unquote, lived in another world, that she couldn't really talk to him. There's still a great wariness in Germany, but I think with what's happened in the United States and with the state of the U.S.-European and U.S.-German relationship, that's already caused, again, somewhat of a reassessment in Germany, although, as I say, there's still great wariness. So let me now turn to the United States and Russia. I think it's still fair to say that the relationship is as bad as it's been, or the worst it's been since before Gorbachev came to power. And of course, one of the major reasons for this is because Russia has become such a toxic issue domestically. I don't have to tell you that. I think in a way that it hasn't been since the McCarthy era. And I think for many people who oppose President Trump, the words Trump and Russia are interchangeable. And sometimes my Russian friends and colleagues, not all of whom necessarily support their own government, say, we can't understand how you Americans have, you've built us up to be this giant, this colossus who can come in, we can disturb your democracy, we can threaten, hundreds of years of your system. Why do you think we're that powerful? And I think it's worth contemplating that, but certainly domestically, obviously, it's been very difficult to move anything forward. And this is the unique part of it. It's because of the association between President Trump and Russia. So despite his attempts, of course, and his commitment to improve ties with Russia, he's been very hamstrung. It's possible that what we've seen today is the beginning of a process of at least trying to normalize the relationship. I think from the administration's point of view, with the release of the Mueller report, he probably, and the White House certainly feels that they can move ahead. And there are very pressing issues, in fact, that we do have to discuss with the Russians. We can ask whether the Russians have any buyer's remorse over their interference in the 2016 election, because they maybe didn't realize that the knowledge that they did that would make it so difficult to move the relationship forward. One thing that Mr. Putin was hoping for, I think, when Mr. Trump became president, and which Mr. Trump said he was going to do, was the lifting of the post-Ukraine sanctions. Well, not only have they not been lifted, but Congress has now taken the power away from the president. Under Obama, they were imposed by executive order, and therefore they could have been moderated or lifted. Congress has taken that power away, and we have rafts of sanctions that have been imposed. And I think today another new raft of sanctions was proposed, introduced in the Senate. I don't know whether it'll get through. But so it's been very, very hard to move at least even the economic relationship forward. It seems to me that today there are really two aspects of U.S. policy to Russia that are identifiable. And one of them is the sanctions regime. I think you can argue how effective it's been. It's certainly imposed economic costs on Russia. I think most people think about 1% of GDP growth per year. But they certainly haven't changed anything that Russia has done, either in Ukraine, Venezuela, or anywhere else. And the problem with the sanctions is that there's the congressionally mandated ones, there's no quid pro quo. The original post-Ukraine sanctions said, if Russia makes concessions, if it begins to fulfill the Minsk agreements, which were signed, well, first of all in September 2014 and then February 2015, if it begins to fulfill them, we'll start rescinding the sanctions. But the congressional sanctions are purely punitive. They don't have anything that says, if Russia does this, then possibly we'll lift them. So it makes it very difficult to envisage when and if they will ever be removed. And then I think the second aspect of U.S. policy really is the wariness about arms control. So we're now in a situation where in 1972, Richard Nixon went to the Soviet Union while the mining of Haiphong was going on, and he signed an arms control agreement with Leonid Brezhnev called the SALT I Treaty. And by the way, there are people who do say that in some of the conversations that Nixon and Brezhnev have, there were no note takers present. So when we think about what happened at Helsinki last year, it's not the first time that happened. So they signed that agreement, and then they signed another major arms control or agreement, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which we pulled out of in 2001. Anyway, that was the beginning. And then, of course, in 1987, we signed the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces with the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev's Soviet Union, where we destroyed an entire class of intermediate-range missiles. Well, the United States pulled out of this INF agreement a few months ago, saying that the Russians were violating it. And the Russians have said that they've pulled out of it, so that's going to be over in August. But then there's another agreement. That's the, if you like, the follow-on from the SALT I agreement in 1972. It's called New START, and again, it regulates strategic nuclear weapons. This agreement expires in 2021. Now, it could be automatically prolonged for 5 years, or a new agreement could be negotiated, or the U.S. could just say it's not interested in doing this, and the Russians could too. And it's not clear that the United States is interested in prolonging this agreement. President Trump has said that we have to have a new agreement in which China will be a participant. The Chinese have said very clearly they're not interested in being involved in a strategic arms limitation treaty because they don't have too many weapons in that class. Anyway, the Chinese have so far said they're not interested. So we'll see what happens. It's possible that the US and Russia could agree to prolong this agreement and then try and persuade the Chinese to come in. There are serious issues, obviously, with China building up its own nuclear arsenal. But if not, we could be left after 2021 for the first time in 50 years, really, with no regulations that can limit or where we have insight, really, into what the Russians are doing. Nothing regulating the US-Russian strategic arsenal. And I think that's very dangerous, and so do most people who've been involved in these negotiations. But we'll have to see what happens. We've lost most of our channels of communication with Russia. Our militaries do communicate regularly because we still have to deconflict our air operations in Syria. We have to make sure that we don't have an air accident and something unforeseen happen. The Chief of the General Staff, General Dunford, now outgoing, has met quite a few times with his Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov. But beyond that, a lot of the military contacts that existed, even during the Cold War, those channels have been cut off because of what happened in Ukraine and since then. We have other issues where we do need to work. I mean, we have a channel theoretically on Ukraine. We have Ambassador Kurt Volker and his Russian counterpart, Mr. Surkov, but they haven't met for months, and I think the Russians are waiting to see what happens with the new Ukrainian government before they meet again. So this is an area where we should be involved with the Russians, but where really there's a stalemate at the moment. I guess one of the few areas where we are working together to some extent productively is the Arctic. There was just a recent meeting, of course, of the Arctic Council where Secretary Pompeo and Mr. Lavrov spoke, and that was the time when, of course, the United States wouldn't sign on to the agreement at the end of this meeting because it mentioned climate change. So in the end, there wasn't an agreement. But anyway, if you put that aside, we are working with the Russians there, and we have been cooperating in space. So there are a few channels still open. And of course, at the best of times, the US-Russian relationship is compartmented. Cooperation exists at the same time as we compete. It's always going to be like that. It's just that the avenues of engagement now have become much more restrictive. So what we do see is a Russia more or less at the moment turning in on itself. We can talk about succession, but even though Mr. Putin is only due to leave office in 2024, and it's a number of years to go, there are still rumors, there's still questions about what's going to happen, and that I think also informs in many ways the way Russia behaves. We see a Russia now trying to restrict its population really from the global internet. It's passed a number of laws on that count. And I think we probably have to assume that even if there is a slight improvement in relations now between the US and Russia, that it's going to take a very long time to restore anything like a more, let's say, normalized relationship. And again, if you look at the history of US-Russian relations, there have only been a few times when they've really worked very well. And that's been when we've really had common interests with Russia whose definition we can really agree on. You can go back to World War II. Obviously, we had a common enemy. You can go back to the period just after 9/11 in the fall of 2001 when the Russians really were very helpful in the initial phase in Afghanistan. And it is interesting to hear again today, Secretary Pompeo said Afghanistan was one of the things that was discussed. But again, once the common enemy was defeated in both those cases, be it World War II or in this case the initial rout of the Taliban, then things got much more complicated. And I think the US and Russia still have very different definitions of what a productive relationship would look like. And I think for Russia now, under President Putin, but maybe under any president, one of the conditions is for the United States and its allies to accept that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. I think some of what you see in Venezuela now is the Russians saying, okay, you think you can get involved in Ukraine, we can get involved in Venezuela. They want that recognition, and they want the United States to recognize that their definition of their own interests are legitimate, and particularly, again, in their neighborhood. And obviously that's something that it would be very difficult for the United States and its allies to do, but that is often one of the real stumbling blocks in moving this relationship forward. So I think what we have to accept, obviously, is that Russia isn't going to become what we thought it was going to become in the 1990s, and I think we've more or less accepted that. I think we have to just find the areas where we do have common interests and try and move forward on them. We have to be patient. I think we also have to be willing to respond positively if Russia sends more positive signals, and Putin certainly said a number of very forward-looking things today, but let's see whether the Russians act on them. And then I think the final point always to remember is that the Kremlin doesn't speak for all Russians, and that even though it's becoming harder now to interact with ordinary Russians, a lot of the student exchanges and things like that, it's more difficult to do them. They haven't been completely cut off, but they've become more restricted. We have to keep trying to do that. But I think we also have to understand that at least the US-Russian part of this will remain a very challenging relationship as long as Putin is in power, and probably even once he leaves power. So I'll stop there.
First question, sir. The question was some time ago, probably in the 70s even, but anyway, 30 years ago at least, China has tried to incorporate some of Western values in their economy, and they have participated in the international economic system. Is Russia inclined to shift their economy in that direction at all?
So, and that, it's interestingly enough, it's a very interesting question. And if you go to China and you talk to China about Russia, they will also say they find it baffling, really, that Russia hasn't modernized its economy kind of in the way that they did, so that they were able. I mean, they developed obviously a capitalist economy, even though they don't call it that, they're a modern economy and they participate in the global system. This partly comes back, I guess, to the question of kleptocracy. Russia is a raw materials exporting country. It gets most of its money from sales of oil and gas. And the people around Putin who own many of the assets of the country, they've all gotten rich from these kind of assets. And Putin has surrounded himself to some extent with more, we call them liberal economists, liberal in the sense that they believe that Russia should modernize its economy and become more integrated in the global economy, apart from its oil and gas sales. And they've urged modernization, restructuring. The problem is that what Russia has to sell to the outside world is oil, gas, and other minerals and arms. That's it. And they would like Russia to modernize its economy. But every time they begin to do that, there's resistance from the people who earn large sums of money from the rents from oil and gas, and they don't want to do it. So, and if Russia doesn't do it, then Russia will fall increasingly behind not only China, but a number of its neighbors in Asia and other places, and not modernize. And throughout Russian history, it's been a pattern that when the czars or the Soviet general secretaries began to embark on economic reform, they then pulled back because it was politically, too destabilizing. And so far, Russia hasn't made the choice that China made. Does Putin have enough influence with the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates to get them to pay for the reconstruction of Syria? I mean, he's certainly going around, right? And he's asking for money from all different quarters. And of course, with the Saudis, it's, ironic because it's not exactly as if they were backers of President Assad, right? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that he does. What do you think? You don't think so? Okay.
The question is, what do you think Steve Bannon has in mind for Soviet-U.S. relations?
Well, we'll say U.S.-Russian relations.
Yes,
Mr. Bannon has some. At one point, Mr. Bannon tweeted when he was still in the White House that Vladimir Putin is the savior of the white race against Muslim hordes. Now, that, putting everything else aside, that of course completely misunderstands what Putin is. There are 20 million Muslims, or more than 20 million Muslims, who live in Russia, and they are the one part of the population that's expanding. And so Putin is very careful in dealing with his own Muslim population to respect them. Obviously some of them have gone and fought with Islamic State, but at least to respect them. And the last thing he would want to do is to have himself identified as this kind of leader of the white race. I think, in more generally, people like Bannon and let's say people, the more conservative followers of President Trump, look at Russia and they really do see it as the harbinger and the champion of conservative traditional values. When Putin says that the Western Christianity is satanic because it's socially politically correct or whatever, and that Russia is the true harbinger of those values, I think there are people in this country that would support that. I think Mr. Bannon probably looks at Mr. Putin as representing populism, which is kind of ironic. I guess a book has just come out, I'm not saying it's true, but saying that Mr. Putin's worth $160 billion. But anyway, sees him kind of as as a champion of populism, and Putin does, I think, appeal to some of those populist themes. So I think in general, he would think that a better Russian relationship with Russia was desirable. Okay, question, Russia and Libya. So there are two governments in Libya. And Russia, or two seats of power, and Russia basically, has relations with both of them. But the man we're reading more about now, Mr. Haftar, he's been to Russia. The Russians are sort of backing him up in this ongoing struggle there. So I think in Libya, they probably want to make sure that whoever prevails, or if somebody prevails, they have influence with both of them. How does the increased production of oil and gas in the United States affect Russia? It's not good news for Russia. I've been at a small gathering with President Putin where he said how terrible fracking was, and there was someone from Poland in the audience. This was a few years ago when they were going to do fracking in Poland, and he lamented the fact that Polish children's water might be poisoned by the fracking. So for Russia, unconventional oil and gas has been a challenge because obviously if the U.S. is self-sufficient, if it can export and things like that, Russia has more of a competitor. The Russians are actually doing some of their own fracking too. They're trying to deal with this. Obviously, in terms of their relationship with OPEC, they're trying to keep production down. But in general, what's happened in the U.S. in terms of unconventional oil and gas has not been good for the Russians. Yeah, is it true that it's said that the Russians are trying to destabilize Western democracies, the U.S., Europe? Is that something I acknowledge? Of course. So I think what happened. Well, we know what happened even before 2016. Let me go back to 2011. So in 2011, you may have forgotten him, but Dmitry Medvedev was the president of Russia, and Putin had become the prime minister for 4 years. And in September of that year, he announced that he was switching places with Mr. Medvedev, and he was going to go back to the Kremlin, and Mr. Medvedev was going to be the prime minister. And that and an election that was clearly falsified. It was a parliamentary election, and if you go on YouTube, you can see people stuffing ballots. In the age of the iPhone, it's a little harder to keep this stuff secret. So that led to tens of thousands of people going out in the streets in Moscow and demonstrating against Putin and saying, we don't want you anymore, we want you to go. And that was a real shock for Putin. He thought, who are these ungrateful people? Their standard of living's risen. They live in nice Moscow and they're protesting against me. And he blamed the United States for it. He blamed Hillary Clinton for paying the demonstrators to go out in the streets in Moscow. And I have to say, Secretary Clinton, also had some nice words to say about Putin and about the way he treated the population. Anyway, he then became convinced that, the U.S. was trying to effect regime change in Russia, and that therefore it was fair game for Russia to do whatever it wanted to do in the U.S. That's not to say that during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States didn't try to, affect the domestic politics of the other country. They did. But we're now in a social media age, and therefore it's, the possibilities are greater. So I think what the Russians then did was, even before they knew who the candidates were, we know from the Mueller report that they sent people over here to scout out the social media landscape. And they became, they were pretty savvy at understanding our own political polarization. And then as the campaigns continued, and when Trump became the candidate and everything, that's obviously when we know that they had the internet troll factory in St. Petersburg that was mobilizing, rival groups, Black Lives Matter versus white supremacists and other groups, to sort of mobilizing them on social media and taking advantage of the polarization that existed here. I think that they didn't create the divisions, but what they really wanted to show was, first of all, if you can do it to us, we can do it to you. But the other message that I think Putin and those around him wanted to give is, you tell us that we're not democratic and you criticize us for our domestic system. Look at your domestic system. Is this what democracy is? Is this what people want? And, you see that a lot on the Russian TV, state-run TV. And then, of course, we know that there was also cyber interference. I mean, today I was just seeing they said on CNN that 2 Florida voting machines now, they know, were sort of penetrated in 2016. They didn't necessarily affect the vote count, but they were penetrated. So yes, I mean, and they're going to continue doing it. We know that up till the midterm election in November, the day before that, there was a story in our newspapers that the U.S. Cyber Command had to take action because of what the Russians were doing. So maybe, there'll now be an agreement that we won't do it to each other, but I would be very skeptical about that. And, you can see in the European Parliament is having elections coming up very soon, and we know that the Russians have been up to all kinds of mischief there too. So they have the ability to do it, and they do it.
Let me ask you to comment on the history of that and how long the Russians have been trying to disrupt the American system.
Well, I think you have to go back to the Soviet period, right? I mean, I think throughout the Soviet period, or certainly, maybe after the war, after Stalin's death, maybe, but even before. Well, first of all, throughout the Soviet period, the Soviet Union could always mobilize groups, communist groups in the United States or Europe or other parts of the world, the developing world, and the United States clearly, we did things both in Europe and in the Soviet Union where we were, well, particularly in Europe after the war, where we were supporting groups that were anti-communist because we didn't want the communists to come to power. So in different ways, this has been going on, but I guess the means were different. You had radio broadcasts, you had, obviously, the Soviets would plant articles in newspapers. I'm sure, some of the same stuff was done by the United States. So it's not the first, it's not something new, but I think it's the range of possibilities are greater now. This comes back to the sphere of influence, and particularly the Baltic states. And would NATO essentially defend the Baltic states if they were attacked? It's a very good question.
What was the question?
Oh, would NATO defend the Baltic states if they were attacked by Russia? That was the question? Yeah. So it's, as I say, it's a good question. When the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, if you talk to people now who were involved in those negotiations and the decisions, they will now say that at that time they didn't really think seriously, because it was a different time, that that would be an issue. Obviously, if you join NATO, there's something called Article 5 guarantees, which is collective defense, and it means if one member of NATO is attacked, the other countries all come to their defense. And in fact, the only time that that's ever been invoked was after 9/11, when our NATO allies said, they supported us. So once Russia annexed Crimea and started the war in southeastern Ukraine, there was a lot of concern about whether NATO guarantees were valid, because if you look at a map, they're right there next to Russia. And I think the other thing that's concerning is if you look at public opinion polls, particularly the Pew Center and I think the German Marshall Fund have done polls showing that in a number of European countries, Germany, but not only Germany, a large number of the population say they don't think that their country should fight to defend the Baltic states, for instance, or another country if it's attacked. So support for that part of NATO isn't very high. I don't know what it was 20 years ago, but it certainly isn't today. President Obama went to Estonia after the events in Ukraine, and he reassured the Estonians and the other Baltic states that the NATO guarantees were valid. But I think some people, have questions about them. The Rand Corporation did a study after all of this, which I guess went into some detail about the question, are the Baltic states defensible? Again, if you look at the map. So one hopes that if something happened, there would be a defense. Then the question is, what are we talking about? I mean, there's a conventional military attack, but you could also have cyber attacks, which the Russians already done that in the Baltic states. You could have something short of a conventional war. So at what point do you define this as an attack that warrants an Article 5 guarantee?
With respect to the Arctic and the Belt and Road Initiative, in what way would the success of those things change the relationship between China and Russia?
So we're talking about the Polar Silk Road. So I think from the Russian point of view and the Chinese point of view, this is obviously quite desirable. I guess the China National Petroleum Corporation has now bought a stake in Novatek, which is a major Russian gas company, and they're all involved in the Arctic exploration. And the Russians, so both countries want this joint cooperation on these trade routes, these economic projects to go forward. I think the other Arctic states, including obviously the United States, are a little bit more wary about the nature of China's participation in these Arctic projects, because China, of course, isn't actually an Arctic literal country, but obviously is participating in it. So I think this will all have to be worked out, but I think probably from an economic point of view, it will benefit both sides. Does Russia acknowledge climate change in any significant way? So President Putin a number of years ago said there's nothing wrong with it being 2 degrees warmer in Russia. It's a cold country. So first of all, if you look at sort of the facts, there are certain parts of Russia that probably do benefit from climate change in as much as they have a longer growing season. But there are also parts of Russia for which, climate change has had very adverse impact. You can see that in the Russian Far East. There were, with all the melting ice and everything, there were impassable roads. I mean, a couple of summers ago, the mud and everything. So the Russian government acknowledges it. In fact, today Putin said that he wanted to cooperate with the United States on environmental issues, so I guess we could include that. But in general, the Russians, ordinary Russians, this is not something that they would talk about very much. There are climate scientists in Russia who study this and who work with their American and European and other counterparts on climate change and understand the seriousness of it. But it's not something, if I think about what goes on campuses in the United States now and things like that, that's not something you'd find in Russia. Do I think there's a quid pro quo associated with the Russian interference in the elections? So in other words, what the Russians have said is, we want to sit down with you and we want to work out an agreement with you where we both agree not to interfere in each other's elections. So in theory, that would be possible. The problem is, would the United States believe that something that the Russians signed was trustworthy? And the Russians would probably say the same thing. In other words, unlike an arms control agreement where you have kind of verification procedures, I guess you could continue to try and verify it, but at what point would either side say, we're going to stop doing this, but we're going to, but on the other hand, not knowing what the other side will do. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that. This is about the relationship between Russia and North Korea. So Russia has always been a secondary player in the events on the Korean Peninsula and following China's lead. When we did have six-power talks, right, in the 90s, etc., the Russians were included in that, but again, they more or less followed the Chinese lead. I think it's been difficult for the Russians since President Trump began, his initiative to talk to Chairman Kim. Although Russians whom I've talked to, they've always acknowledged that what Kim Jong-un wants is something guarantees from the United States, and that Russia, can be help with this or something, but Russia can't give the North Koreans what they want. So from the Russian point of view, they don't like the fact that North Korea is a nuclear state, because what they worry about is, further proliferation. Japanese, South Koreans, someone else might want to acquire nuclear weapons. On the other hand, they also don't like the idea, although nobody's saying it's a possibility now, of a united Korean peninsula under American influence. So they would like to be able to restrain, obviously, what the North Koreans do, but, as long as they have reasonable relations with them. And so I think it was what Putin was able to do once the second Trump-Kim summit didn't work very well, was then to re-invite Kim Jong-un. He was supposed to go to Russia in 2015 to commemorate the World War II anniversary, and he didn't then because I think his position maybe wasn't as strong. So he did go there. They met in Vladivostok. It's hard to see what came out of that. Because Russia can't give North Korea the sanctions relief at once either. But at least Russia established that it's a player there and, could maybe make itself useful.
I'll do the absurd and apologize for what time it is. And we do end the session at 7:10. So unfortunately, it's time to thank you for an extraordinary evening.
Thank you.